Welcome, everyone. This is the first official release of De-Bose, the podcast. It's an episode that I recorded many moons ago, and I guess thanks to this pandemic, I can now actually actively release all of this content that I've been basically backlogging. So this episode is an interview with author Bill Knoedelseder. He wrote the book I'm Dying Up Here. You can purchase that book where all books are sold. It charters the comedy boom of the late 70s and early 80s in Los Angeles, California. He is also a St. Louis native and a former reporter for the LA Times. And this book is also they've turned into a television show, and it's also on the basis of a show about the Comedy Store, Hollywood, California, on Showtime. So be sure to check that out and click like and subscribe. And you can also follow me on Instagram and any number of social media networks. De-Bose. Welcome to De-Bose, the podcast. And welcome to De-Bose, the podcast. I'm De-Bose, as you know. Thank you for tuning in. Today, I have an esteemed author, Mr. Bill Knoedelseder. Bill, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We're here recording at the Tree Force Studios in Hollywood, California. Feels fancy saying that in Hollywood, California. But really, I just know a guy. So Bill is an author. He's also a former reporter, and he's here to talk to us today about many of his projects. I've got so many questions because you're also from St. Louis, Missouri, a fellow St. Louisan like myself.
Proud St. Louisan. Proudly
from St. Louis, a graduate of UMSL, right? University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Right.
Funny thing about St. Louis, people usually don't leave it. So what prompted you to make the great migration out west?
It was the mid-1970s. I was just out of college. There was a hiring freeze at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that lasted several years, and I wanted to be a writer, and there was no place to really be a writer in St. Louis, and if you wanted to write, I had to go somewhere else.
What about the Evening World? You could have wrote for the Evening World.
Well, I don't think they were even there then at the time.
They were there.
Were they?
Yeah.
Well, you know.
The Evening World is St. Louis's local newspaper dedicated only to crime.
Oh, wow.
That's it. It's just mugshots.
I'm sure they
police
weren't there
blotters.
in the late 70s. I don't think so.
I think it was there.
Really?
I think so, because I think they've been around since like the 30s.
I would have read it.
But it got a big resurgence in, I think, like the 80s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But they recently did add an advice column called Ask a Pimp, where you can, write in to an actual
There's
pimp.
so many things I'd want to ask.
Yeah, get some love advice, folks. Yeah. So they're hiring freeze at St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
Right. So I knew that if I was going to write about things, I didn't know much about how to do that other than I had some ability. And I knew that I had to live in either New York or Los Angeles or Washington, probably D.C., where bigger media markets than St. Louis. And so chose Los Angeles.
Did you know anybody when you moved out here?
My then wife's parents had just moved out to Los Angeles from Washington, D.C., so we had a place that we could stop and drop our things down and try and figure out where we're going to live. So that's what we did. It was sort of, chosen for us, and the rest is history. What can I say? It was a good move.
Whether D.C. or L.A., you're still going to be able to write.
Yeah. When you grew up in Missouri, when I did, mid-70s, when you were stepping out, California looked pretty good. I mean, that was the music scene out here, And,
you're right. That's mid-70s.
Yeah, right.
Good swinging times.
The Doors were playing down on the Strip, and, come on. It was a pretty exciting place. So, and there was warm weather. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How long did it take you to kind of get acclimated to?
Well, it took...
Because I know it can be a culture shock.
Yeah, it was a culture shock, but it took about a year before I felt I was in. It took me until I got work. It was a hard scrabble looking for work for a while, and all of a sudden I landed a kind of a freelance gig at the LA Times, and I never lacked for a day of work from then on. It was a lucky break.
Now, did you want to be? You went out for reporting, but it's LA. You didn't go into screenwriting or
never did.
Yeah, novelist.
I'm just starting to try my hand at it now, actually.
Nice.
I don't know why I waited so long. I just had this idea. I did it one time, and it was odd. Mm-hmm. And I said, nah, that's not what I do. I do another thing. But I think I'm going to try it because there's more money in it.
Well, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I know a lot of people don't, when they say they're a writer out here in L.A., they don't mean I'm an investigative reporter.
Right.
They mean I'm a novelist or I'm a
Right,
screenwriter.
exactly, yeah.
Or they just mean I'm an aspiring writer.
Yeah, well,
they're not an actual published writer.
Now they say, well, what do you write? I say books, and there's a puzzled look, and you go, those things that, the books, some people don't know what you're talking
those
about.
Things that you sometimes use as coasters.
Yeah, right. Exactly,
those.
yeah.
So you've written about several different types of subjects, but usually it all comes down to big industry. So, you've written about the stand-up comedy scene in the 70s. That became a television show, I'm Dying Up Here, which is an incredible book. Like, your style of writing, it is in the style of an investigative journalist, but it's really entertaining. Like, it's almost as though you were there. It's crazy.
Yes, exactly. Right?
How did you end up on that gig? How did you end up?
Well, I started writing for the LA Times. I was just trying to sell stories. I hadn't the faintest idea how to go about this, and I happened to meet and have a meeting with a guy who had just moved out here from Minneapolis, and he was the editor of the entertainment section of the LA Times calendar. And he was new in town. He was like Lou Grant. He was my Lou Grant. He was this crusty guy from back east. And he kind of liked the way I wrote. I didn't have any sources. But we hit it off, and I stumbled on an assignment that story he liked, and he published it, and it was above the fold on the top of the page and
Front page.
Of the calendar section, the entertainment section at the time. And then the next day, I got a call from the Washington Post, and they wanted to publish it too the next day, and I'd sold the story twice to two major papers in 24 hours, and I was like, whoa, this is cool.
On to something.
And then and again, it was that kind of story. It was sort of an investigative story that I wasn't looking for. I stumbled on it, but it had some humor possibilities in it, and also some, very social stuff. And it launched everything for me because he just kept giving me assignments, and I eventually got on staff and stayed on staff for 12 years. And it was at the LA Times, which was the richest paper in the country. I mean, the biggest, fattest, richest paper. You could write forever. And they had the space because they sold so many ads, and that's how newspaper is done. The editorial space is just depends on how many ads you have. Mm-hmm. They can always add editorial if they can sell the ads. So at the LA Times, if you wrote, it got in. Whereas at the New York Times, you could write a great story. They just have room for it. So it was a great place to learn how to do long form journalism. And there were amazing editors, and I got an education, the likes of which is not provided to any journalist anymore. Maybe at the Washington Post because it's some of the same people that I work with at the LA Times. But it just doesn't, it's different.
What would you say is the biggest difference?
The number of layers of people asking you questions about this and clarify this and do that. So by the time it gets in the print, there's no mistakes in there. Everything is vetted. And you know what you're doing, and there's not embarrassing gaffes, and because sometimes when in the heat of putting together a story, you need a lot of eyes on it, and that's how I learned. I learned by having pushy little people on the copy desk saying, "I don't understand it, I don't get it," and then if they didn't get it, you could be sure that a lesser reader out there wouldn't get it either, and they needed to get it. So then you would sort of grudgingly clarify it that it would be better, and you would see it all the time. It's better. So I learned how to really hone it, and I learned a way to write it. And it was all largely because my editor was just this brilliant guy who was his whole idea was he wanted reporting about show business that told the regular person how it works, how this industry works, not what's before
no
he
jargon,
came on.
just
what
nuts
they
and
always
bolts.
did before entertainment reporting prior to the mid 70s was promoting whatever the big companies had out in the marketplace that week and writing stories about it the way they wanted it, so they would know. They would have a story about the actor who's starring in that movie or the actress, and that's what it was. Well,
so an
my
extension of
editor's name was
publicists.
yeah, right, exactly. Well, there were a lot of publicist generated stories, and some of them are great. Some of my best friends in life were publicists because a lot of them, they knew stories, they knew what was going on. But my editor was really, really brilliant. And he was the one who called me in one day and he said, there's something going on here in town having to do with all these young comics who are coming in from all over the place. It feels like it feels like Greenwich Village in the early 60s. And, you know, it's an art form that's really unique, and nobody's ever covered it. And he was from the theater background in Minneapolis. And he said, would you like to cover the comedy beat here in town? How about it? No one's ever done that before. And I was like, oh, my God, because I grew up watching every comedian that ever appeared on television. And, you know, so it was like I got the best job that anybody could have possibly imagined for me at that point in my life.
So what was your process? You would just go to the Comedy Store? You went to the Improv? Where all did you go?
Yeah, you'd start going to the clubs. I met the people who did of course, you meet the publicists, you know, whoever was, there was a woman named Estelle Endler who was great, who was the publicist for the Comedy Store. And, you know, my job was to find out who was going to be the next Freddie Prinze. Mm-hmm. Okay, what's happening? What are they about? Where are they coming from? Blah, blah, blah. You know, and we were all contemporaries. We were all about the same age. We were, you know, our mid-20s. They'd all come here from someplace else, so I could relate to them completely. And I started, you know, going and learning about their lives and things like that. And then, you know, then that's when the Comedy Store strike happened, right in the middle of all this. So it took kind of a serious turn. At first, I didn't realize it was a serious turn because it seemed like a lark.
Oh, no, jokes are serious business.
Well, with that, well, you know, and now that
business.
It was dark, too. I mean, it was, you know, so many comics they become your sources and stuff, and they'd have your telephone.
Would they rat each other out, like, to be your source?
I wasn't doing that sort of thing, but they would call you, you know, about something, and, you know, they would be having a crisis, and you would know about it, and they'd be having, you know, so you kind of knew you'd got that they were sort of dark, and they had a lot of issues, and that they were comedians because they were trying to cope with some things, and they were a different sort of artist, and they were tortured, and the ones that were the solidest, you know. It's funny because Letterman and Leno, they were solid. I mean, they weren't full of problems, and I don't know why. They came from maybe a more white bread, solid background.
Letterman was a weather guy, wasn't he?
Weather guy in Indianapolis. So it was an uncomplicated life he'd come from. Same with Leno. So they didn't bring a lot of, you know, stuff
a lot of drama
to
the table.
Just
were there any people? Because you got to see what are now considered, you know, some legends in comedy. But are there any people that remained unknown that you felt could have made it?
Generally, the geniuses, the people who are really, really talented, you know, it's kind of hard to keep that back. Mm-hmm. You know, if they got a stage and there is media in town, you know, like there was, you know, it's hard to disguise it. They may explode and implode or do whatever else and crash themselves, like, you know, Richard Pryor tried to do a bunch of times. But you know, the talent does out, and it was fascinating. It was just endlessly fascinating to cover that, the art and the world of it, you know. And it was an amazing time. And it's hard to, you don't realize what you're living through as you're living through it.
Right, because it doesn't feel like
history. It just feels like a bunch of young kids having a good time getting high. And right, exactly.
Good friends, you know.
And it was a different kind of comedy, and it seemed, you know, it was wonderful. I don't think I ever enjoyed a process more than covering the comedians.
Now, the show, when it became the show on Showtime.
Right.
The first episode, spoiler, the first episode when a comedian steps off, he like leaves.
Right, yes. Right.
And he steps in front of a bus.
Right.
Was that kind of representative of Steve Lebitkin, or is that,
you know,
that was just to get your attention?
I had nothing to do with the television show, other than the fact that they bought the rights to my book and they based it on my book. But I didn't have any input into the scripts and the cast and all that stuff.
It's a great show. It was fantastic.
I cashed the checks.
And that's the most important part.
Yes, that's right.
Cash the checks, as long as they clear.
And they made the decision to fictionalize it rather than go with the real characters.
Yeah. I mean, it's still, we all, me and other comics, we'd all watch it and try to guess, you know, what character is kind of based on based on whom? And
Well, I don't know. I don't know that they other than the Mitzi Shore, that's so obvious.
Yeah.
The rest of it, I don't think there was a particular character they were going for. They used
Or maybe
some
they just
things
kind of
from the
mixed
book and they
other-
sort of they twisted it around. I
Some
mean,
creative
the two
license.
guys from Boston, a lot of their experiences came from Jay Leno's experiences. And things like that. I could see that, and then they would take things and and change them. So I saw everything.
Yeah. I mean, you write a lot about these kind of larger than life characters in these larger than life industries. Mm-hmm. Like when you wrote with Finn's Bitter Brew, writing about the Bush family, the Bush Empire. Do you think we'll see a change with more women being in more positions of power in these industries? Not necessarily brewing.
Oh, I don't think
that's
it.
still a
I don't
boys'
think
club.
it can be stopped.
Yeah.
I mean, look what just happened in the election. I mean, look out. I'm sure. I mean, everything is changing. It's slow, but it'll happen.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Do you think St. Louis will change?
Boy, I hope so. I just saw a thing today. Well, there was a thing today. There's a new movement, a new push to get rid of the division between the St. Louis County and St. Louis City and go back to where it was in like early 1876, I think is when they split. But that's basically the problem with St. Louis.
Yeah, they keep going back to these old world methods that don't work.
But what happened in 1876? They decided to divide the country into the county and the city. Mm-hmm. And what happened was, as people got money, they moved out of the older part of the city, and so the tax base went to the county. They get all the money and left all the poor people in the middle of the city, and they got no services.
The poor black people.
Exactly.
Let's be specific.
And it's terrible.
It is
just terrible.
When I tell some people, about like the have you seen the Spanish Lake documentary?
No.
They did a documentary on Spanish
I used to
Lake.
live near Spanish Lake.
White
So,
flight.
yeah, right.
I grew up in Hazelwood.
Oh, okay.
Like the unincorporated area by that golf course.
Yeah.
Eagle Springs.
Bristol Hills.
Okay, so like
Hathaway
the Bell
Hills.
Fountain
Right,
kind of
sure.
area.
Bell Fountain neighbors. Exactly where I was from.
It feels like whenever I hear people, and it's usually white people. They have this nostalgic view of the neighborhood that I grew up in, but then it's gone now. Like it's almost like it all got torn down, or they just have moved on with their lives and they behave and speak on it as though it's not there anymore, and it is.
Well, some of them are. Is Kinloch still there?
It is not.
That's right. It's gone. It's
Kinloch
gone.
is
right.
not. I drove through there
Right.
about 2 years ago. And basically, they're going to turn it into a giant distribution area for Amazon,
Right, yeah.
Schnucks,
But I remember Kinloch.
FedEx, yeah.
And,
it's just they to starve these communities of these essentials, and then watch as they kind of tumble into this chaos, and they say, "See, look, I told you this is what happens. Mm-hmm. We can't." My first job was at the Lewis and Clark Library, off of Lucas and Hunt.
Oh yeah.
And the librarians there were so mean and evil and just not very nice people. But they were also really they were in their 80s. Like I think one lady was in her early 80s. And I recently got a book about North County where it fondly recounts their happy days. It's in quotes. So I guess it's the TV show, The Happy Days.
Yeah.
And I got it. When I was leafing through it, I was like, okay, I get it. These old county employees thought they had it made in the shade after World War II, when they were probably young and just starting their families. And now they're forced with change, which is the bane of existence for pretty much anyone remaining in the Midwest. I was able to kind of ease up on my anger a little bit.
Well, that happened everywhere, though. It's just that St. Louis, it was more pronounced, I think, because of the county-city thing greatly. It happened in every city coming back from World War II out of Detroit. All the suburbs went up, and everybody wanted to move out in the suburbs and have a house, and those who could did. Yeah. And as they moved out, they left the cities to the people who didn't make much money, and therefore the tax base couldn't support, and they were abandoned. And St. Louis was just more of a divide than most, I think.
But also not as progressive. It feels as though folks really hold on to these.
Well, Missouri is pretty...
Missouri in general.
But I mean, I lived in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is very, their view. When I moved to Philadelphia, I lived in L.A. so long, and it was the opposite of L.A. in that if you have a new idea, and if you have an idea you want to push in L.A., you tell everybody it's a new idea, and I go, really? And they're interested. In Philadelphia, instead of a new idea, they go, "Well, I need a new idea. What is that?" It's like it was the opposite reaction. Yeah. If it was new, I'm not interested because I got whatever, And the attitude was different, So
I mean, do you see that like with your new book with Finn's writing about Detroit?
Right.
Do you see Detroit coming around too? Like what
I think it's coming about around soon. I'm not that up on Detroit, what's going on there now, but Detroit had a long way to come back. I mean, my God, but Detroit had the same thing happen there. I mean, the area of Detroit that's the equivalent of Kinloch, I mean, basically was bulldozed into the ground, right around the time of the civil rights movement. They called it, urban renewal. It was basically Negro removal, and it's what they did in this 60 square block area known as Black Bottom. Having nothing to do with people's skin color. It
was very fertile soil.
Yes, right, exactly right. That's gone. You can't even see it because it's all been bulldozed under and it's highways. And it's underneath freeways. But there was this giant neighborhoods and businesses and people, and it was very poor and all kinds of vice and everything else. But it was also a place where a lot of families, and a lot of famous people came from. A lot of art, When
I was reading, a lot about like St. Louis, and I realized how many famous people came from either Vashon High School, where my mom graduated, or Soldan or Sumner. And I was like, wow, so many famous St. Louisans, famous black St. Louisans came from these schools. It didn't occur to me that was because of segregation, and that was like the only black, like designated black high schools in the region.
Right.
But the Negro removal you were talking about. I think that's what happened with Central Park in New York City. That originally that area that became Central Park was a village for freed black people. And then they decided they wanted a park. So they kicked them out, tore all their houses down, and now there's a park.
Doesn't shock me.
Yeah, so there's that. What interests you in a topic to write about?
Well, I've always written books about things that interest me, and it's not like I went to pick them. The first book I wrote grew out of stories I did at the LA Times, and it all started with one thing. Met an actor at a party, and he had been an actor in the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I started talking to him. That was interesting. We're talking to this guy. He said, yeah, we made this movie. We're all just a bunch of stone hippies in Austin, Texas. And we made this movie, and it was really crazy. And we didn't know what we were doing. And we ended up selling it to the mafia, unbeknownst to us. And I went, what?
Unbeknownst to us.
Right. Okay. So that's me. I'm going, mafia? Really? Tell me about that story. Yeah. So the next thing I know, I'm doing this case history of mafia infiltration of Hollywood, how the mafia, a mafia family in New York, who were involved in the porn trade and who basically were the guys who made Deep Throat. Okay. They made Deep Throat for like $25,000 and made literally...
That's a very high budget for a porn film.
Yeah, and they made $100 million.
Wow.
In cash over a period of time. And they took that money. One of them had ambitions to be a legitimate filmmaker. His name was Butchie Perino.
That's a great porn name, though.
And he decided he would open up a Hollywood film company, and he would make legitimate movies. So this is like
money laundering for the mob, or he just did his own thing?
He just wanted to make movies. He was serious. He wanted to be a legitimate guy. He was like Sonny Corleone. He wanted to break away from the whole history of his family went back in the mob for, 30, 50 years, And so he came out here and he sort of hid who he was, and nobody sort of mentioned his background. He was just a financier from New York, and he ended up he bought and distributed Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Jodie Foster's first movie, John Travolta's first movie. The list went on and on and on,
Wow.
And they were very, very successful and got a lot of publicity. The first couple of years they were in business. And so, and what they did was that these young Texans, when they made this movie, they went looking for a distributor, and they ended up
stumbling upon that guy.
This guy in New York, and they bought the rights to the movie. And then, of course, they got in trouble because they got prosecuted for pornography.
Oh, wow.
The guys who ran the company. And the minute that happened, they sort of reverted to mob stuff, and they stopped paying bills, and and they went out of business, and the people who were the profit participants in the films did not get paid. But for me, it led me into this whole area of organized crime reporting, because I had to go to New York and meet all these organized crime cops who knew all the backgrounds, and I was running around Bensonhurst in police stations. So I learned I developed a whole bunch of sources in organized crime law enforcement back east. So then within a year or so, I tended to look for mob things, and I stumbled onto a situation where I was covering the record business for the LA Times and the financial section, and I stumbled across this Gambino family soldier who was involved with a major record company. And I know from what I've learned recently, something wrong with that.
Yeah.
What's that about? So I went looking at that, and that produced maybe 20, 30 stories over a couple of years, having to do with this one case, and it became my first book.
Do you feel like they could have ran kind of under the radar if they just paid people?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, they could have become a legitimate entity. I mean,
they just paid people.
Yeah, well, they're the same guys who basically built the porn business in the Valley.
Oh.
Their legitimate movie business went out of business. But they started
like most struggling people in LA. You turn to porn.
Exactly. Well, so they started up the business in the Valley. It's still going.
Wow.
And they still own the rights to Deep Throat. I think they've made $600 million now or something like that. Last I heard,
$1 billion.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And he's dead, and other people run it. But that's there's a chain there.
Have you had any backlash from anyone in the Bush family for Bitter Brew?
Nope.
Really?
Nope.
They're totally fine with everything?
I don't know. They're totally fine, but there's probably some like it, and I know that some like it. I imagine that some don't. I have not heard from any of them. They're used to stuff like that, I guess.
I guess they're used to.
What are they going to do? Sue me? It's true.
I think it was.
They know it's true, so they're not going to sue. Yeah.
I think Billy Bush got arrested recently for he beat up a kid. I think he fought like some child on his son's
he got into
basketball
some sort of thing. We've been following the news.
Yeah. I looked it up because I was like, this is so insane.
He got upset with some kid that was playing soccer against his son
like
and put him up against
man.
the wall. Yeah, right, exactly.
Roughed up a child.
But that's because
his kid couldn't fight. All right.
Yeah.
Put him in some boxing lessons.
Yeah. Well, they're a colorful family. Whenever one time I was speaking about it to some big gathering of people in Chicago or some investors group, and they asked me to speak, and I was trying to explain to them about the Bush family, because most people don't know about the Bush family. They didn't really make the headlines the way a lot of other people who were even not as wealthy as they were did. And so I would explain to them, I said, well, back then the Bushes were, in St. Louis, the Bushes were like the Kennedys, but with guns.
Right.
That was the difference, And
that's who they are.
Yeah, right. They came from a particular background where everybody was armed, and women were to be pretty and have babies, and the boys made the beer and made all the decisions, and no woman ever held a position of authority of any particular authority, beer making authority at Anheuser-Busch, and the company was handed over to the firstborn son of the firstborn son. It was very Roman, almost.
But you didn't think that maybe if they started bringing some of the women in, it would be,
of course,
you wouldn't have.
Well, because if you do it the way they did, well, if the way they did it, you were invariably going to end up. The company was going to be taken over by the person who got the job just because of the DNA and where they are in the birth order, not because they were the most competent. Mm-hmm. That's the history of dynasties in companies. Mm-hmm. And there was nothing, it was pretty predictable that would happen. At some point, maybe, it could have gone on longer. But
I feel like after the first dead hooker, though, you should probably be like, maybe my son isn't cut out for this line of
well,
work.
I do want to say that the first girl was not a hooker.
Right,
she was a very nice,
very kind-hearted waitress.
Yes, right. No, she was edgy.
But after the first death, you should be like...
Well, you figure, I think I said that in the book. I said, here's a guy who seems to have developed a habit of having young women die in his presence. Full of drugs, Now, most people, that doesn't happen once in your lifetime,
right?
But he's had it happen twice. And
interestingly,
it happened 20 years apart. But the girl was the same age both times. She was 26 or whatever. So
you should be like, maybe he should go into carpentry.
Yeah,
perhaps this isn't his thing.
He doesn't really have to do anything with the money he made on the sale. But
so you also researched Barry Diller. Right? Who started?
Well, I worked for Barry Diller for a long time. I never did anything on. I never did a book.
One of the CEOs or creators of Fox, the Fox network.
Yeah. Barry's a billionaire. Barry's one of the major moguls of show business. I mean, he hired me away from the LA Times. Mm-hmm. He had been the head of Fox. He was the guy who launched the Fox television network for Rupert Murdoch. And that's when I worked for him. I worked for him at 3 different companies over a period of 6 years. And he left Fox, though, when Rupert would not let him become an owner. Rupert didn't want to give up ownership. Barry wanted a piece of the company. And when Rupert wouldn't do it, Barry left and then formed his own company and became a billionaire. So,
like you do.
Yeah, they're like, like those guys do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there's a common trait amongst these captains of industry? Is there one thing that kind of ties them all together?
No, I don't. Maybe a personality type, but I think that it's oddly because I got to know Barry really, really well, and as well as you can know, he's my boss and all that. But he was the first, as you would say, great man that I worked for. He was the smartest brain I've ever been in the same room with, and I saw what a visionary is, because he was kind of out there in space looking back at the rest of us and kind of thinking things up, and he would what if things out, and he would say things, and he'd leave the room, and I'd be exhausted from the mental wrestling match that we had gone through, as him trying to get me to understand something that I didn't get right away, but that I would eventually get and go, oh, I know what he's after, and it was fascinating, and I understand why he is a billionaire. Yeah. I understand how he got there, and I understand how he operates, and so when I was doing the Finn's book, the one that just came out about Harley Earl, he's the same kind of personality as Barry, in the sense that he was very driven, and he had a viewpoint, and he was after something, and he was trying to create something that had never been done before. Barry was always about, there's no reason to do something if it's not new. Okay, so he didn't want you to just, do another slick version of the news. He wanted you. And so when I was seeing what people who worked with Harley were saying about him, I recognized that character from Barry.
So a very forward-thinking person. Right,
and who saw this, here's what I want to have done, and I'm placed in the position here of getting it done, okay? So, and I've gathered these people here on this staff and in this to execute this vision that we're going to all kind of come up with, but it's mine. And any pushback on that, if it's not a really good idea, get rid of them. I don't, we don't have time to push back on this. We have to push forward. So there was an impatience and a demand for, and you had 15 seconds to get his attention, because there were so many things he was into, and you had to really be prepared when you sat down with Barry, because he had a wall of TVs behind you that he was looking at while he was talking to you.
Wow.
And he would understand what you were saying and follow it, but so you had 15 seconds. And if you didn't get him, it was gone, and it might be a while. So it was fascinating. Riding with Barry Diller was a thrill ride, and I loved it.
Sounds like a really highly functional ADHD person. like someone with like severe ADD, but they're like productive.
Yeah, I don't know if he was ADA. He was very productive, and he would try anything. I mean, I remember one time and people laughed, but I got what he was doing. He called up and he was looking at he had started this new news thing at this television station, KTTV down here, Channel 11.
It's called what?
KTTV, I think it was called. It was Channel 11. It became the Fox station. It was the Fox O&O. And so he was trying to shake up the news, and he was experimenting. And one day he called down the newsroom and said, "Okay, I want a wall of phones in the back of the room, and I want them to be bright colors." And he started giving all these sort of like set decoration things, and people were like, "What, is he crazy? What are you telling?" And they weren't even hooked up phones. But what he was going for was what Barry was thinking of, was it's all the same. All these news shows on are just all the same. They're all just eyewash. They all blend into one another. And he was trying to figure on this particular day how to break up the look, make the eyes of the audience stop on this newsroom in the background behind the anchors. What about this would make them stop and watch this? And that's a legitimate thought if you're trying to attract an audience to your news.
Which you'd only figure out if you're watching a wall of TVs.
And if you thought that way, if you thought nobody else had ever thought about, maybe there is something to making their eyes stop and go, wow, that's something about that. They would never notice that it was red phones or yellow phones or whatever else, but they'd stop because something about that popped.
Yeah.
Now, it seemed silly, but it really wasn't.
It is a really like a groundbreaking idea, because it makes me think about CNN, how from what I can recall, it looked like an actual newsroom. And so you would think, oh, we must really be getting breaking news because they're in the newsroom. They're not just in a studio, but it's a studio.
Right.
Obviously.
Right. Well, Barry was always about they're all the same. So how do you do it not cookie cutter? How do you make it sound different? How do we make them talk different? Because the truth of the matter, and I was totally agreed with him on this, was that news people talk in a way that nobody else in the world talks. Mm-hmm. They have a cadence. They have a way they do things that they learned how to talk, and up until not so much anymore because it's very opinion. But back then there was news speak, and if you heard anybody talk like that out on the street, you'd go, what? So why did they all talk that way? Mm-hmm. They were all the same. So he was about breaking up all the cookie cutter doing of the news, and that was fun to try. Do
you feel like Elon Musk could be like that next big person you write about with that same forward thinking mentality? And
well, he certainly has that. I mean, he does that. Yeah, I don't know him personally, of course, and I don't know, if he's capable of, doing what Barry's done. Barry makes a profit. There's always that, but yeah, he's that sort of visionary kind of guy. I mean, he's come up with he's the guy behind Lexus. You can't hardly argue with that. How you make it profitable still, I don't know that it is, but it's an amazing car. I've driven one, and it's it's for a week, and it's like you just realize, well, every other car is like.
Oh, it is? Oh, okay. I thought it was
they're totally. Yeah, you drive a Lexus and you realize, well, this is where it has to go. If they can make it, if they can make it profitable. Of course, they're probably going to have non-driving cars, which I think will be a shame. But
that's part of the fun, though. I feel like that's almost a rite of passage. But we're also both from the Midwest.
Yeah, I want to drive. I don't want my car driving without me.
I want to make a decision. I want to go where I want to go. Pick up a friend or not.
Yeah, I want to become one with that machine, but. It's my brain that's driving it.
Yeah, I'm in control. I like that.
Yeah.
So when you were, you've never been tempted to try stand up yourself when you were out on the beat?
No, I never was, and I don't quite know why. Ever since I was a kid, I was really loved comedy, and when I was young, my dad worked for a car company, so I grew up in the Midwest and worked for a car company. So we transferred around a lot. So every couple of years. We transferred, and I was in a new school, and I was the new kid, and I found out really quickly that you could break down all barriers and get into any, be accepted by all little cliques, if you were funny. Right. Everybody liked funny, and
humor
funny
is universal.
If you were funny, the jocks liked you, and the hoods liked you, and whatever group, so, I sort of figured out. I had a sense of humor. My dad had a sense of humor. So I figured out how to be funny. And I got to the point where, I got used to people saying, boy, you ought to be on a Carson show. My friends' parents would tell me that.
Right.
Because I'd come over to dinner and all of a sudden I'd go off on a riff and I could feel it happen. And I'd have them all, But I never, ever, ever wanted to get up on stage and do it for a living. I don't know why. It seemed like that would not be, then I would not, it wouldn't be funny. I wouldn't be funny if I did that, because then I'd be being calculated about it, because it always just sort of happened. I never thought about what I was going to say or what I would, understand?
It was just something that just happened organically.
Yeah, and I always totally was amazed and appreciative of comics. I thought
that's the best part of it, though, is trying to make it as natural as possible, even though it's a routine.
Yeah. Well, when I listen to comedy, I'm sitting there, I'm appreciating the writing while I do it too. Yeah. I know a really well written comedy routine, and I can see it. And who does it? Dave Chappelle does things where, oh my God, he will say something, and 15 minutes later, he has gone on to 10 other things, and he will all of a sudden button up that thing he said 15 minutes ago, and you almost fall out of your chair, and you realize that man just wrote to that.
Oh yeah.
That just didn't happen. And it's brilliant. I mean, he's the only person I've seen who is up there. I think that, for me, Richard Pryor level, and maybe better.
Have you
he
seen?
Says kind of quietly.
Have you seen his Netflix special, The Bird Revelation?
Huh.
Genius.
Really? Oh well. See,
it is.
I was
genius.
recently had this. I was at the Improv meeting someone. I was meeting my manager, and we were doing something. We were sitting there, sitting out in the bar. And somebody comes by, and my manager, Sherry, knows him, and she introduces me to this guy. I said, Bill's wrote I'm Dying Up Here. And his reaction was like, there's only a couple places where I'm famous.
Right.
Comedy clubs in St. Louis. Okay, other than that, I give you. But so next thing I know, we were being invited in the back room where something special was going to happen.
Ooh.
I said, okay, so I'll take this little bit of perk that I get for having written this book 10 years ago or whatever it was. And they sit us at a table, and within a couple minutes, they announced that Dave Chappelle is going to come out. Now, I've never seen Dave Chappelle live, and my table was right there. I could have reached up and poked him on the knee, And Chappelle did, I don't know,
probably
an hour and a half off the top
2 hours.
Of his head, it seemed like. And I've never seen anything like it. I've seen Pryor, but it was amazing.
I would say, and because Dave Chappelle is, I've said this many times, I sound like such a nerd when I say it, but Dave Chappelle is the reason that I do stand-up comedy.
Well, I can see it. Oh, no, he's at a different level. I always used to say, before Dave Chappelle came along, is that, there's Pryor, and he's the Van Gogh. Yeah. He's Van Gogh, and then there's all the other impressionists, but he is the Van Gogh.
Impressionists.
Right. Yeah.
Polite.
Yeah, right.
He's brilliant in the sense of a lot of very thought-provoking material sprinkled in with like a lot of very like silliness and shit jokes.
Sure.
And that I think that's kind of the glue. Yeah. Because you can't be too heavy throughout the entire set, but you also can't be too frivolous. And he weaves them all together so seamlessly. I mean, he's been doing it obviously for decades, since he was a teenager. Yeah. But I would love nothing more than to pick his brain.
Who I saw recently who knocked me out was, because she's from back in the day of I'm Dying Up Here, Marsha Warfield.
Oh yeah, she's back on the scene now.
Wow, is she good? I mean, she hadn't lost a step. She was hysterical, and it was extremely well written. Again, I was seeing where she was going with it, and I hadn't seen Marsha Warfield. She'd left the business kind of
for years. I think she was in
and she
Vegas
was so current and so. But she was doing, the older comic bit, but making it very current, and speaking as the older woman, and she was hysterical. It was a joy to see.
I think comedy, there's a place for everybody in comedy, and I know that, with a lot of people piping up and they're like, anyone here straight white man? Like, I get it. You can want whatever you want, but there's a space for everybody when it comes to comedy. Like, anything can make you laugh. A child can make you laugh. A funny pair of shoes can make you laugh. But to make an audience of people, strangers who don't know you, laugh on purpose,
right,
for money, repeatedly,
right.
that is something that really should be, dare I say, respected.
Oh yeah.
It's not an easy thing to do.
It's always been, the most emotionally difficult of the performing arts.
Yeah.
I think. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Anyone knows. You're not hiding behind a role. You're basically up there saying, "Love me, laugh at me."
Yes.
It's hard. There's no character you're doing. Some maybe a little. They're creating a character.
Characters. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah.
So, Andy Kaufman,
Yeah.
what was his deal?
Boy.
I think that's the only way I can...
when I thought that what he was, he had somehow managed to control multiple personalities through meditation or something like that. That explained, I don't know if it's true or not, but he was a really interesting character, and you never knew. I mean, I never knew him. Really, I mean, I spent a lot of time with him. I spent a whole evening with Tony Clifton one time, and it was somewhere within 100 yards of here. There used to be a motel.
Tony Clifton is Andy Kaufman's character, right?
Yes.
And then afterwards, like another dude, took
Bob
over that
Zamuda
character.
Picked it up and they kept the Tony Clifton.
No, but this was
going.
back when it was Andy Kaufman.
He would do it as a character before they got famous. And so when I was assigned to do, by my very forward-thinking editor, to do I told him, I said, there's this guy named Andy Kaufman. He said, let's do a piece on him. And so I was going to do the story of Andy Kaufman, and I insisted. I talked to his manager. I said, but part of the deal is, I said, I want to. And Andy, would never break that character. If he was going to be Tony Clifton, he would never admit that he was Tony Clifton. He would just...
So you couldn't be like, hey, man, come on.
So I said, I'm not going to do a story on Andy Kaufman and then do anything about Tony Clifton unless I can spend time in an interview with Tony Clifton. I want to see him in that state, okay?
That is crazy.
Yeah. But so, I did an interview with Andy. He showed up at my house one night. We were going to do this story.
You showed up to get your address. What do you mean you showed up at your house?
I'll tell you why. I'll tell you how. We were set to do an interview. And a couple nights before the interview, I get this call at my house. I mean, his manager gave him my number, I guess,
okay.
whatever.
Okay.
Hi, it's Andy. I go, oh, hi, Andy. She said, can I come over to your house now? And I went, well, sure, why not? I
would have been like, no.
Well, because I knew I was dealing with a very unusual performer, and he was in the middle of some street there, and he wanted to come over to my house and do the interview now. I said, all right. So I'm there with my wife, who's like 8 months pregnant.
No.
And Andy comes over like 15 minutes later, shows up at my house, knocks on, and he's got a cardboard suitcase full of outfits and stuff like that, and he proceeds to start doing his act. On my patio. He's got his wrestler's outfit. He switches. He's changing costumes, and I ran out of. I was taking pictures, and at one point I ran out of film. I just made like I didn't, because he was doing the bongos on my barbecue, and had this insane evening with Andy being the stage character.
And you were the only one there.
Just my wife and I. And she was like 8 months pregnant, and he then got into his wrestling, went into the bathroom, got into his wrestling outfit, and wanted to wrestle her. I've got pictures of that. I took a bunch of pictures. I've got some priceless pictures. But then after that, we had, after that thing happened, I get a call one day from his manager, George, says, you might want to be over on the Taxi set today. Something's up that you might really want to see. Mm-hmm. So, they arranged for me to get on the Paramount lot, and I always carried my camera, because back in those days, if you took a picture, you got paid $150. The story was only $250.
Really?
So, yeah.
Okay.
So I had my camera. I think George might have alerted me to have my camera with me. So the story was Andy got them to hire Tony Clifton while he was on vacation. This is the story that he sold to them and that they went along with, winking all the way. Okay, Andy's being...
No one at any point was like, no, we know it's you.
Well, sure.
Stop the madness.
The staff knew that this was not a Tony Clifton. This was Andy. But you understand, Andy's genius, madness, whatever you call it, was to never cop to that. Kind of like Trump in a way. Just we'll sit there and just say the same thing that he knows is not true, and everybody knows is not true. Andy would not cop to the fact that he was Tony Clifton. So Tony Clifton comes to work, has a separate contract, okay, and he
Who
shows up.
negotiated the separate contract?
His manager. And the producers went along with it because they thought it'd be good for the show. It'd be an interesting, creative thing to go along with this. But Tony shows up, and Tony is a complete asshole. Okay, Andy as Tony is a complete asshole. He smokes all the time, and he's literally has a trailer out back, and he's got hookers, and he's drinking all the time. Now Andy neither drinks nor smokes, but as Tony Clifton, he did. So anyway, they get so frustrated with him, and the staff is so upset with him that they decided the only thing they can do, they can't reach Andy. You can't get Andy to come forward out of Tony Clifton. So the only way they could deal with it is to fire Tony Clifton. So this happens as I'm sitting there in the like the little grandstand thing for the audience. I'm sitting as they're filming this sitcom, and Tony comes in and he's like got whiskey in his breath. And he's got two hookers, okay, and he's like giving out gifts to the staff, and they're all pissed and that. And the extra producers come in, they tell him he's fired, and he goes crazy, okay, and they have to call the security guards, and they have to wrestle him outside. And they're trying to throw him off the lot. And, of course, me being the reporter with the camera, seeing something that no one else has ever seen, I'm, like, taking pictures like crazy. And the security guards grab me and take my camera.
Why?
I don't know. But they were burly guys. They took my camera. I wasn't going to get into a fight with them. I figured I'd get it back. I'm the LA Times, after all, So
did you get it back?
Yeah, I got it back. Okay. But then that night, goes on. And then that night, I met Tony... Okay, right. For an interview, somewhere within 100 yards here, there was this cheesy old motel. It was a hooker motel. Okay.
Oh, my God.
And that's where he was staying. Tony was staying. It was all set up. I walked into the room, and there's like Sinatra records around, and he's there, and he's this character, and there's porn magazines everywhere.
Did he bring his own record player?
Please, I'm telling you, it was. And so we decided to go out and go have a drink or something like that. So as I recall, I picked the place. I said, well, let's go there. Okay, so we go there, and we go into this bar, and it's owned by a Greek guy, and his daughter is working the bar, and she's this young girl. And Tony starts being lewd to her.
How young are we talking here?
Well, I don't know how old she was. She might have been 21. She was a young girl.
Oh, okay.
Tony was supposedly like 50,
with
40,
the whole
50.
Being R. Kelly thing going around, that
he's
could be
being crude
different.
And lewd to
a young woman.
Whose father is right there.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking...
Did the father know who he was?
How would nobody knew who
so
Tony
this was
Clifton?
Not arranged. You picked
Tony
the
Clifton
place.
was not a famous Andy Kaufman character at the time. He was just a guy that Andy played in clubs. If you happen to catch Andy in a club, you might know Tony Clifton. He'd never been So I thought he was going to get us killed. And then he ended up picking up this girl at the bar.
The girl, the owner's daughter?
Another
different girl.
Sort of Hollywood waif, And he invited me back to the motel with them, and I thought, I'm going to draw the line here.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be... If this is real, I don't want to have anything to do with it. If it's not, go ahead and play that. I've got enough for my take on it. It was a memorable night. So I don't know. I know people who know and loved Andy, and
he kind of seemed like a real odd fellow.
Oh, he was an odd guy. But I tell you what, I have children who are 19 and 20 years old, and I have my son when he was in high school, he's not 26, he had a couple of the pictures I took of Andy in his wrestling outfit on my patio. I had him framed, and he had him on his wall. He's got like Dylan and, John Lennon, whatever else he's got. And his friends would come in, and they were, as I say, 19 years old. This is not that long ago. He's just 26 now. And they would go, oh, my God, that's Andy Kaufman. Where'd you... And Colin would say, well, my dad knew him. What? Your father knew Andy Kaufman? And I'm like stunned that they even know who Andy Kaufman is, much less are blown away by the fact that his father took those pictures and once knew Andy Kaufman. But that's the impact of Andy Kaufman. There's something about the weirdness that he did that has survived a lot of comics. My kids know Robin Williams from a whole different thing than I know him from. They know him from, the funny movies he made, the Disney movies.
The Aladdin.
And not only that, but also what's the one where the old woman,
Mrs. Doubtfire.
Mrs. Doubtfire. They love him for Mrs. Doubtfire. Yeah. But they don't know the crazy, druggy, guy that was so.
That's my. I remember seeing Robin Williams like as a kid doing like that stand up they did. Yeah. I think it was like Stand Up to Hunger. Yeah. With him and Billy Crystal and Whoopi Goldberg.
Right.
I do vaguely remember that. But my big Robin Williams thing is I remember him as the genie in Aladdin, Mrs. Doubtfire, and Jumanji.
Yeah.
The original one.
But when Robin Williams hit the stage at the Comedy Store, when he burst on the scene, I got a call, said, there's this new guy in town. You've got to see this. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I went to the Comedy Store, and I saw this guy literally explode. I had never seen anything like it. It took your breath away. There was no template for what he was doing.
What was he doing?
He was it was free form. It was surreal. It wasn't jokes. He would just take off and start doing something. He'd play off something. He'd pick up a bottle. It was a little bit like Jonathan Winters, which was his, where he could pick up anything and all of a sudden just get into a conversation about it that was brilliant, or he'd go into some Shakespearean soliloquy about,
Wow.
And it was just like I'd never seen anything like it. It was utterly different from anything else. Well, Andy was too, but Andy really wasn't a stand-up comic. He didn't do.
He seemed more like a performance artist.
Yes, he was. That's exactly what he was, and he had a weird thing that he was about. But he had an art that was, that has lasted, and they still get it. They still fall down and
I don't, but okay.
Yeah, well, a lot of people don't. The whole thing with the Mighty Mouse thing. Here I am in the day. Where he'd play the Mighty Mouse theme, and then he'd.
Oh wait, you're talking about Robin Williams now.
No, I'm talking about Andy.
No, I don't know.
Robin was, his. And I remember when my son, again, he's 26 now. The first time he saw Robin do a routine, he knew him from those movies too. But then when Robin came back and did a stage show, where he did the thing about this Scottish guy explaining the game of golf.
Of golf, yeah.
Colin laughed so hard. He'd never laughed so hard in his life, and he couldn't breathe. He thought this was the funniest thing he'd ever seen in his life. He said he didn't know that there was a level of comedy that made him laugh that much. Yeah. And this was like late in Robin's career.
Who was your favorite to watch back then?
Well,
like if you heard that they were on the lineup, you would not miss it.
Well, Pryor, but you couldn't get in Pryor. Robin. Richard. I loved Richard Lewis. I like Richard Lewis on several different levels. Richard Lewis was just the best person, and Richard is just like that. That's just Richard. He's like that off the stage or on the stage. Richard just figured out a way to do himself on stage, make it the same thing. There is no difference. There's no artifice there. Richard doesn't watch any other comics. He stopped watching comics because he was afraid that in his way of pulling stuff together and just reacting, he'd accidentally
absorb what they're doing
and not even mean to.
Yeah.
He understood why that happened with Robin. Robin did the same thing. He would just suck up everything, and it would happen while he was, and stuff would come out, and it would be somebody else's. He hadn't written it and intended to steal it, but it would come out, and then they would get comics. You know how they are.
I know.
Yeah. So anyway, the old days. Yeah. George Carlin, of course.
Oh yeah. So what was that like being able to watch him live?
Well, I don't know if I saw him at the back in those days. He was kind of moved on. He was like a big guy at the time. He was doing big shows and movies when I got here. But I remember him when I was still back in St. Louis, when AM/FM came out and the seven words you can't say on television. I made sure my children knew those 7 words. I told my daughter when she was 7 could recite that. I was so proud of her.
We got to listen to it in school, actually. We played it during our speech class so that we could learn. I think the teacher used it as an excuse to say, this is like different examples of public speaking.
Can you say them? Can you recite them?
No.
I can. Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucking motherfucker, and tits. Those are the 7 words. Still is the 7 words you can't say.
I think you say tits now.
Can you say tits?
I think you can say tits now.
And as he said, tits didn't even belong on the list.
Yeah.
I mean, well, it was, that was.
Yeah. My exposure to a lot of like you being able to see like the beginning of their careers. My exposure to it was they had already blown up and they were already doing more family friendly projects.
So for example, Jay Leno. All right. Jay Leno in a club, back then was brilliant. I mean, brilliant. And Jay could he'd go on forever, and he would just start talking about the headlines, and he was great. And he rocked the place. And then he was really funny when he was appearing on Letterman's show. That's how he got his big break, because when Letterman got a show, he put Jay on all the time. But when he took on the Carson show, the Tonight Show, I never found it funny. Because he was doing very,
Was it just too formulaic?
Right, it was too. Yeah, it was. It didn't play to his strength. I mean, I didn't think he was doing it because it wasn't edgy enough or something like that. I just found it. His shows were better. If you went to see a show of his at the same time, it was better. I saw a show of his during the time that he was doing the Carson show. I went to Vegas and he did some corporate gig, and a friend of mine was putting on the show, so I got in to see Jay do a corporate gig. I think they were introducing the drug Claritin, okay? Oh. And there's a big Claritin corporate. They'd spent a fortune, and my friend put on these big shows, these big corporate shows.
Claritin.
Made a lot of it, and they were doing it, and all the Claritin people there. And Jay, of course, flew his plane in, and, an hour away or whatever it was, and probably collected $150,000 for doing an hour, if that. And he was hysterical. And then he went back and he was on the Tonight Show the next night doing, a different kind of thing altogether.
Is it true that he never cashed any of
his
stand-up checks? That he just invested them?
He has no hobby other than cars. That's pretty much what he
does. And Seinfeld both really into cars.
Yeah. You can go. There's a regular car show out in Woodland Hills every other week in a big parking lot and something. And you can go out there. Jay will be out there. Just hanging out in his blue jeans and kind of talking to car guys.
I can see him doing that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, hanging out.
Yeah.
Bill, this is fun. What's your next project? Is there anything that you're working on right now?
I am, but I cannot tell you because we'll talk.
It's secretive. Top secret. Well, thank you so much for stopping by.
No problem.
A great conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing you around some more. Folks, thank you for tuning in. This is Bill
Knoedelseder.
Bill Knoedelseder. Where can you be found online? On the internet?
BillNoedelseder.com.
Okay. Spell the last
spelling
name.
Knoedelseder. You got that?
Boom.
It means noodle cooker in German.
That's nice. That should be like your Instagram name. Bill Noodle Cooker. But and thank you for tuning in to De-Bose, the podcast. Good night.